October 2nd, 1957, 1:13 a.m. The air in the back room of the Venetian Social Club on Sullivan Street was thick with the ghosts of stale cigar smoke and spilled grappa. It was a small room, maybe 12 feet by 15 feet. A single unadorned light bulb hung from a frayed black cord, casting long, dancing shadows that made the two men in the room look like giants locked in a final grim ballet. The first man was Vito Genovese. He was 5 feet, 7 inches tall, but the weight of his reputation added a foot to his stature. His face was a mask of cold disappointment, the kind a father wears when a favored son has irrevocably failed him. The second man was Gerardo Jerry Catena, Vito's underboss. He was on his knees. Catena was a big man, broad in the shoulder and thick in the neck, but on the cracked linoleum floor, he seemed to shrink with every passing second. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his face pale and slick with a sweat that had nothing to do with the autumn humidity. Vito's hand was steady. It held a Colt Detective Special, a .38 caliber revolver with a 2-inch barrel. The blued steel of the barrel was pressed firmly against the sweat-dampened skin of Jerry Catena's left temple. The pressure was precise, not a threat, a statement of fact. "You took an oath, Jerry." Vito's voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it filled the room, smothering every other sound. "You swore it on a saint, to me." Catena's mouth opened, but only a dry rattling sound came out. His eyes were wide with a terror so pure it was almost sublime. He could smell the gun oil. He could feel the cold circle of steel that represented the end of his entire world. Vito Genovese's thumb, thick and calloused from a lifetime of grasping for power, pulled back the hammer. The sound was a sharp, metallic click that echoed off the bare plaster walls. It was the sound of a period being placed at the end of a very long sentence. He pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing. The hammer fell on an empty chamber with a dead, hollow sound that was somehow louder and more final than any gunshot. The room went silent. What nobody knew, what the history books and the Senate hearing transcripts will never tell you, is that this moment was not an execution. It was a lesson. It was the culmination of a plan so intricate, so psychologically devastating, that its true genius was understood only by the man who conceived it. To understand why Vito Genovese would place a gun to his own underboss's head and pull the trigger on an empty chamber, you have to rewind. You have to go back to the chaos that followed the biggest disaster in the history of the American underworld. The year was 1957. The location was Appalachian, a sleepy town in upstate New York. On November 14th, the heads of every major crime family in the United States had gathered at the home of a mobster named Joseph Barbara. The agenda was simple: to formally recognize Vito Genovese as the new boss of bosses, the undisputed king of the Luciano family, soon to be renamed the Genovese family. It was meant to be his coronation. Instead, it became his humiliation. A sharp-eyed state trooper named Edgar Croswell noticed the parade of expensive black Cadillacs and Lincoln Continentals rolling through his quiet jurisdiction. He got suspicious. He called for backup. Within hours, the estate was surrounded. The bosses, the capos, the most powerful criminals in the nation were caught like rats in a trap. They fled into the woods, their $1,000 suits snagged on branches, their polished shoes caked in mud. Over 60 of them were detained, their names and faces splashed across every newspaper in America. The Appalachian meeting was an unmitigated catastrophe. It publicly exposed the existence of a national crime syndicate, a concept that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had long denied. It brought an unprecedented level of federal heat down on everyone involved. For Vito Genovese, the man who had called the meeting, it was a personal stain. He had orchestrated the murder of his rival, Albert Anastasia, just weeks before. He had forced Frank Costello into retirement. He had consolidated power with brutal efficiency. Appalachian made him look like a fool. In the weeks and months that followed, a dangerous power vacuum emerged. The commission, the ruling body of the mob, was in disarray. Bosses were under indictment. The old ways of settling disputes were suddenly impossible under the glare of the federal spotlight. Rivals, men like Carlo Gambino and Meyer Lansky, who had always resented Vito's ambition, began to circle. They saw a wounded animal. They saw an opportunity. They whispered in the shadows, questioning his judgment, his leadership. Was Vito still the man to lead them? Or had his arrogance finally doomed them all? Vito understood this dynamic better than anyone. He was a student of power, a grandmaster of a violent and unforgiving game of chess. He was born in Risigliano, a small town near Naples, and he carried the old world's understanding of power in his bones. Power was not just about force. Force was crude. Force was temporary. True power, lasting power, was built on something else entirely. It was built on respect, which was a currency earned through a careful balance of generosity and fear. But more than that, it was built on intelligence, on knowing what your enemies and your friends were going to do before they knew it themselves. This was Vito's code. He saw himself not as a gangster, but as a protector of his community. The gambling dens, the loan sharking operations, the control of the unions on the waterfront. These were not just rackets. They were the engines of an alternative economy, a system that provided for the Italian-American immigrants in Greenwich Village and Little Italy when the legitimate world turned its back on them. He provided jobs, settled disputes, and maintained an order that was often more just and more efficient than the city's own. In return, he demanded absolute, unquestioning loyalty. Loyalty was the foundation upon which his entire empire was built. Betrayal was not just a crime. It was a sin, a violation of the natural order he had so carefully constructed. His underboss, Gerardo Jerry Cattina, was supposed to be the bedrock of that loyalty. Cattina was from the New Jersey faction of the family, a shrewd and capable earner who controlled lucrative operations in Newark and the Jersey Shore. He had been with Vito for years, a quiet, effective lieutenant who had proven his worth time and again. Vito had elevated him, trusted him, brought him into the inner sanctum. He treated him like a younger brother. In Vito's mind, their bond was supposed to be unbreakable, forged in the fires of shared risk and mutual profit. He saw in Cattina a reflection of his own pragmatism, a man who understood the delicate dance of their world. This trust, this deep-seated belief in Cattina's allegiance, would become Vito's greatest vulnerability. And for his enemies, it was the perfect crack in the armor of the man they called Don Vitone. The threat did not come from a rival with a gun. It came from men in gray suits who carried briefcases and worked out of a drab government building at 90 Church Street, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. In the wake of Appalachian, the FBN, led by the zealous commissioner Harry J. Anslinger, saw its chance. They wanted to decapitate the mob, and Vito Genovese was their prime target. But they knew they couldn't get to him directly. Vito was insulated by layers of loyal soldiers, so they adopted a different strategy. They decided to poison the well. They would turn his most trusted man against him. Their target was Jerry Katina. They began a systematic campaign of pressure and seduction. FBN agents, led by a senior operative named Joseph Amato, began by building a file. They documented every aspect of Katina's life. They knew about his legitimate businesses, a series of automobile dealerships that he used to wash his illicit income. They knew the names of his wife and 3 children. They knew which church they attended on Sundays. They tailed him, photographed him, and compiled a dossier that was 3 inches thick. This was the stick. Then they prepared the carrot. They approached him through a cutout, a lawyer with government connections. The initial meeting took place on February 12, 1958, in a suite at the St. Moritz Hotel overlooking Central Park. The offer was laid out with bureaucratic precision. They had enough evidence on Katina to send him to prison for 30 years on tax evasion and conspiracy charges. His life, as he knew it, would be over. His family would be disgraced. His assets would be seized. Or he could cooperate. All they wanted was Vito. They didn't need Katina to testify in open court. That was too messy, too dangerous. They just needed him to be their ear. They wanted information on a major heroin shipment they believed Vito was orchestrating, a deal that would be the financial windfall he needed to reconsolidate his power after the Appalachian fiasco. If Katina could provide them with the date, the location, and the names of the key players, they would make his legal problems disappear. Not just disappear. They would erase them from existence. He would be given a clean slate, a federal pardon, and the quiet assurance that his business interests would be left untouched. He could keep everything. All he had to do was give them one man, his boss, his friend. This was the fatal miscalculation. The agents at the FBN were tacticians, but they were not strategists. They saw the world in black and white in terms of leverage and assets. They believed that every man had a price, that loyalty was just a commodity to be bought and sold. They looked at Jerry Katina and saw a criminal who would inevitably choose self-preservation over allegiance. They saw a man motivated by greed and fear, the 2 most powerful levers of human behavior. They failed to understand the complex, almost feudal code of honor that bound men like Katina to men like Vito. They underestimated the power of the oath Katina had sworn. But their most critical error, the mistake that would unravel their entire operation, was far simpler. They underestimated Vito Genovese's reach. They believed their meetings were secret, that their approach was confidential, that their target was isolated. They operated under the arrogant assumption that they were the hunters and Vito was the prey. They never once considered that they and their carefully chosen informant were the ones being watched. They had no idea that from the very beginning, Vito knew everything. Vito Genovese's true power did not reside in the army of soldiers at his command or the vast fortune he had amassed. It resided in his information network. It was a web of eyes and ears that extended into every corner of the city, a human intelligence system that the CIA would have envied. It was made up of the people that society deemed invisible. The doormen who saw who came and went. The waiters who overheard whispered conversations over dinner. The shoeshine boys who listened as powerful men spoke freely on the phone, believing no one of importance could hear them. These were Vito's people. He paid them not in cash, but in respect and protection. He ensured their families were fed and their troubles were handled. In return, they gave him the most valuable currency in his world, the truth. The crucial piece of intelligence came from a man named Salvatore Sal the Bel Bellomo. Sal was not a made man. He was not a soldier. He was a parking attendant at the St. Moritz Hotel. He was a short, unassuming man in his late 50s, a man that people like Agent Joseph Amato looked right through. But Sal was from Vito's village. Vito had helped Sal's family immigrate to America after the war and had personally given him the job at the hotel. Sal's loyalty to Vito was absolute. On the evening of February 12th, 1958, Sal the Bell saw Jerry Katina, his boss's underboss, walk into the hotel. That was unusual enough. But 15 minutes later, he saw Joseph Amato, a known federal agent, enter the same hotel. Sal knew Amato by sight. He had parked the agent's government-issue Ford sedan dozens of times. He waited. An hour later, Katina and Amato left separately. Sal's instincts, honed by a lifetime of survival in a world of secrets, screamed that something was wrong. That night, he made a call to one of Vito's capos. The information traveled up the chain of command, quietly and efficiently. By morning, the report was on Vito's desk. Vito received the news in the kitchen of his townhouse at 20 Washington Square North. He sat at the table, stirring a small cup of espresso, his face unreadable. Any other boss would have reacted with immediate, violent rage. The protocol for this kind of betrayal was simple and brutal. A car ride, a quiet field in New Jersey, a bullet in the back of the head. It was the old way. It was the easy way. But Vito was not any other boss. He saw the board differently. Killing Katina was a brutish, emotional response. It would solve the immediate problem of the traitor, but it would create others. It would sow fear and paranoia within his own family. It would signal to his rivals that his foundation was cracking, and most importantly, it would alert the FBN that their mole had been compromised. They would simply find another one. It was a short-sighted move, the play of a checkers player, not a grandmaster. Vito began to formulate a different plan, a plan that was more complex, more elegant, and infinitely more devastating. He would not just eliminate the threat, he would turn it into an opportunity. He would use the government's own trap to achieve three distinct objectives. First, he would neutralize the federal investigation by feeding them precisely tailored misinformation through their own informant. Second, he would send a message to every boss, every capo, and every soldier in the country, a message about the price of disloyalty and the futility of challenging him. Third, and most importantly, he would use this moment to solidify his own legend, to transform the humiliation of Appalachian into a demonstration of untouchable, omniscient power. His plan was a piece of psychological warfare. He instructed his people to continue surveillance on Katina, but to do nothing else. He watched as Katina had a second meeting with Amato, and a third. He learned the details of their deal. He let Katina believe his betrayal was a secret. He gave him enough rope, knowing that the man would eventually fashion his own noose. For months, Vito treated Katina no differently. He brought him to meetings, asked his advice, shared meals with him. This was the cruelest part of the plan. He allowed Katina to live with the weight of his treason, to sit across from the man he was selling out, and to pretend that everything was normal. Vito began to orchestrate the final act. He started spreading rumors about a massive heroin deal, The very deal the FBN was desperate to uncover. He leaked false details through unreliable channels, knowing they would eventually make their way back to Katina. He created a phantom shipment, a ghost ship sailing from Palermo, loaded with a fictional cargo of pure narcotics. He laid out the bait, knowing his underboss, desperate to satisfy his federal handlers, would have no choice but to take it. Finally, when he was certain that Katina had passed the false information to the FBN, Vito decided it was time. He summoned Katina to the Venetian Social Club. The time was set for 1 a.m. on October 2nd. The pretext was a minor dispute over territory that needed settling. Katina arrived at 12:58 a.m., walking into the back room with the confident stride of a man who believed he held all the cards. He believed his secret was safe. He believed he was just 2 steps away from freedom. He did not know that he was walking into his own carefully constructed nightmare, a courtroom where Vito Genovese would serve as the prosecutor, the judge, and the executioner of his reputation. The stage was set. The players were in position. The final act was about to begin. If this story got you hyped, do me a favor, hit that like button real quick. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? The narrative returns to that small, smoke-filled room. It is October 2nd, 1957, 1:13 a.m. The hammer of Vito Genovese's cult detective special has just fallen on an empty chamber. The dead click still hangs in the air, a sound that has stripped every ounce of hope from Jerry Katina's body. He is a hollowed-out man on his knees, trembling, waiting for the second shot, the real one, but it never comes. Instead, Vito lowers the gun. He does not put it away. He holds it loosely in his right hand, pointed at the floor. He steps back, creating a space of 2, maybe 3 feet between them. He reaches into the inside pocket of his jacket with his left hand and pulls out a single, unlit cigar. He places it between his teeth. He does not light it. "Get up, Jerry," Vito says. His voice is no longer a whisper. It is flat, devoid of all emotion. It is the voice of a man giving a simple, non-negotiable order. Katina scrambles to his feet, his legs unsteady. He stumbles, catching himself on the edge of a small wooden table. He stares at Vito, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and terror. Was it a misfire? A dud premer? Was Vito toying with him? This is the trigger event. Not the fall of the hammer, but the slow, methodical dawning of understanding in Jerry Katina's eyes. The true execution was not of his body, but of his arrogance. "You met with Joseph Amato," Vito states. It is not a question. February 12th, the St. Moritz Hotel, Suite 14B. "You drank scotch. He drank water. He told you they could put you away for 30 years. Katina's face goes white. The blood drains from it so fast he looks like a marble statue. His jaw hangs slack. The name, the date, the hotel room number, the drinks. The details are too precise, too perfect. "Your second meeting was March 7th, Vito continues, his eyes locked on Katina's. "At a restaurant called the Pen and Pencil on East 45th Street. You sat in a booth at the back. He showed you a file. Your file. He offered you a deal. You give me up. You walk away clean. Your car dealerships, your house in South Orange, your family, all safe. All you had to do was give him the details on the Palermo shipment. This is the reveal. The moment the entire board is flipped over, showing Katina that he was never a player in the game. He was a pawn. Vito lays it all out with the cold, procedural efficiency of a federal prosecutor reading an indictment. He details every meeting, Every phone call, every piece of information Katina had passed to his handlers. He even knows the name of the cutout lawyer who first made the approach. The final piece of the trap snaps shut. The shipment, Jerry, Vito says, a flicker of something that might be pity or perhaps just contempt in his eyes. The one you told them about. The one arriving at the Red Hook terminal on October 15th. The ship named the Santa Lucia. There is no shipment. There is no ship. I invented it. For you and for them. The shock that hits Jerry Katina is palpable. It is a physical force that makes him stagger backward. His carefully constructed world, his secret plan for survival, has just been revealed as a cheap stage play, and he was the only actor who didn't know his lines were written by someone else. He sees it all in a flash of horrifying clarity. The months of feigned ignorance from Vito, the casual conversations that were actually tests, the feeling of being watched that he had dismissed as paranoia. He wasn't the betrayer. He was the betrayed. He had been allowed to walk into a trap that had been set for him from the very first day. Vito takes the unlit cigar from his mouth. He looks at it for a moment, then points it at Katina like a weapon. The gun was a test, to see what was in your eyes when you faced death, to see if there was any honor left. The empty chamber? That was my mercy. Now, we are going to talk about what you do next. The lesson was not over. It was just beginning. Vito Genovese did not kill Jerry Katina. A dead man is a message, but a living, compromised man is a tool. Vito explained the new reality to his broken underboss in quiet, simple terms. Katina was now a double agent. He would continue to meet with Agent Amato. He would continue to feed them information. But from this point forward, it would be Vito's information. He would feed them stories of phantom power struggles, of fictional drug deals that would send federal agents on wild goose chases across the country. He would become a weapon for Vito to use against the very people who thought they controlled him. You work for me now, Jerry, Vito said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. You report to them, but you answer to me. Every word you say to them comes from my mouth first. You will waste their time. You will drain their resources. You will make them look like fools. This is how you repay the debt you owe me. This is how you earn your life back, one lie at a time. Katina, stripped of his pride and his power, agreed to everything. He had no choice. He was a ghost, forever caught between the organization he had betrayed and the government that could expose him at any moment, with his only lifeline being the man he had tried to sell out. Word of what happened that night spread not like wildfire, but like a cold fog, seeping into every corner of the underworld. The exact details were never known. There were no witnesses. But the story that emerged, the legend that Vito himself carefully cultivated, was even more powerful than the truth. The story was that Vito had confronted his treacherous underboss, and instead of killing him, had psychologically dismantled him so completely that the man had begged to continue serving him. It was a story of almost supernatural foresight, of a leader who knew of treason before it was even conceived. The reaction from the other families was immediate and profound. In the weeks that followed, secret meetings were held in social clubs in South Brooklyn and cafes on Arthur Avenue. Carlo Gambino, Joe Bonanno, Tommy Lucchese, the men who had been whispering about Vito's weakness after Appalachian, suddenly fell silent. They had planned to challenge Vito, to use the federal heat against him, but this new story terrified them. How do you move against a man who knows your plans before you make them? How do you fight an enemy who can turn your own government into his personal instrument of confusion? They had seen Vito as a bull, powerful but predictable. Now they saw him as a serpent. They realized their fatal miscalculation had been the same as the FBN's. They had underestimated his mind. They had mistaken his post-Appalachian silence for weakness, when in reality it had been the quiet of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The balance of power in New York shifted definitively. Vito Genovese was no longer just another boss scrambling for position. He was untouchable. His status as the true boss of bosses was solidified, not with a public coronation, but in a small, dark room with a single click of a hammer on an empty chamber. The long-term impact of that night was immense. For the next year, Jerry Katina fed a steady stream of useless, misleading intelligence to the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Agents wasted tens of thousands of man-hours and millions of taxpayer dollars chasing ghosts, all while Vito's real operations flourished in the shadows. The government's grand strategy to decapitate the Genovese family had backfired spectacularly, leaving them weakened and demoralized. This event cemented the core principle of Vito Genovese's reign. The most dangerous weapon in the arsenal of power isn't a gun or a bomb. It isn't money or muscle. It's knowing what's coming before your enemy does. It's control over information. Vito had demonstrated that he was not just a crime boss. He was an intelligence agency unto himself, a master of deception and psychological warfare. He had turned the greatest threat to his power into its greatest reinforcement. Jerry Katina remained a high-ranking member of the Genovese family for years, a walking monument to Vito's unique brand of justice. He was a constant, visible reminder to every man in the organization of the price of betrayal and the depth of the boss's reach. He eventually retired, a wealthy but broken man, forever living in the shadow of that night in the Venetian Social Club. As for Vito, his victory was ultimately short-lived. In 1959, he was finally convicted on narcotics charges, a conviction many believe was orchestrated by his rivals Lansky and Gambino, who paid a small-time dealer to perjure himself. Vito Genovese, the Grandmaster, was finally undone not by a brilliant strategic move, but by a simple, dirty trick. He died in a federal prison in 1969, but his legend, forged in moments like the one with Jerry Katina, lived on. It became a lesson taught to a new generation of aspiring bosses. Control the information, and you control the world. So what do you think? Could Vito have handled this differently? Was this a brilliant act of justice or a cold, calculated form of revenge? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And hey, turn those notifications on because next week, we're telling the story of the one man who looked Al Capone in the eye and laughed. A story that proves even the most powerful men have a breaking point. It's going to be even crazier. In Vito Genovese's New York, loyalty was everything, but knowledge was power.